there are over 27,000 abandonware games in worldwide circulation. That is more than half of Steam's current library. And don't think it's just a collection of bootlegs. In this pile are games such as Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Need for Speed Most Wanted, Silent Hill 2 and 3, 10 years of F1 games, and 10 years of games by their developer, Sid Meier's Civilization 2, Battlefield 2, Battlefield Bad Company 2, and many, many, many more. Some of these are also known as delisted games, digital titles that have become inaccessible to all who never purchased it, with remaining keys sometimes listed in the thousands. Currently, there are over 800 games delisted from Steam alone. So, if someone wanted to bring back a delisted game, interview its developers, hire a YouTuber, even employ their own staff to optimize its re-release, why, oh why, would you bring back Альфа-протокол?
To only have ephemeral options for video games is to imply that no one would ever want to engage with them on a higher level, that it's all throwaway junk.
PlayStation have revealed a kill switch that can remove content from your library.
As we saw with the closure of the Nintendo eShop, there are thousands of digital titles that are just gone forever, save for pirated copies.
Even if you have a physical copy of the game, under US law, all you own is the literal piece of plastic.
Because according to the Video Game History Foundation, 87% of retro and vintage games are at risk of being lost forever.
This whole concept of ownership is something that we used to hold dearly in society. You bought something, you paid for it, it is yours, you can do what you please with it as long as you're not harming others.
The assumption regarding ownership of Альфа-протокол was that gamers should not own it. Almost 15 years ago, Obsidian Entertainment's espionage RPG confounded critics with its lack of polish, satisfying gunplay, and intelligent enemies, capped off by some of the weirdest and funniest bugs in a AAA release. But the reason I personally covered this game in detail 3 years ago is that all of these valid criticisms are accompanied by game design that even after a decade remain a role-playing benchmark, most significantly in 2 ways. Unlike mainstream RPGs of the time, Альфа-протокол's dialogue system is wholly unique. Rather than pausing for a list of sentences or paraphrases, you pick one of up to 4 tones in a given time window, meaning this explosive globe-trotting spy adventure, with hundreds of outcomes and dozens of endings, has the same believable flow of conversation you'd find in a traditional linear narrative, with no awkward pauses, void stares, or tell me more about speakers dialogue. Immersing the player like this genre hadn't, and arguably still doesn't accomplish. It perfectly complements Альфа-протокол's contemporary spy setting, one lacking any overt villains or heroes, keeping players constantly on their toes, making decisive judgments about friends, enemies, and even their own motivations. But the reason dialogue is special is how it works with the game's second benchmark, reactivity. In Альфа-протокол, love interests can snipe you after a boss fight. Poorly treated damsels can attack you in the night. Terrorist leaders you're hired to kill can become allies, as can rival agents, who can also be baited to their demise through dialogue. There are bonus missions contributing to the conclusion in tutorials. Dossiers in your codex unlock dialogue options. You can spike the cocaine of an 80s obsessed mob boss after raiding his mansion in a tank offered by a bloodthirsty merc you earn the respect of after trying to kill them. This game is insane.
If you set out to make a game with that level of reactivity, someone should tell you no. Someone who's responsible should say, no, you can't do that. That's unrealistic. That's going to be far more expensive than you know.
We were trying our best to get that reactivity in a single game the first time we put it out there, and the branching kind of, dialogues and emails and everything like that was very much kind of trying to get it all done in one game without having to go back to something previously established. So it was super complicated, super challenging.
But ultimately, because we didn't know that it was going to be so expensive, we did it anyway.
We want people to think about, how they interacted with the world and how the world sort of paid them back for that.
You really felt that you are making a difference with each choice, and every choice was instantly meaningful. That's why I think it is a hidden gem that deserves much more attention.
You're dressed like you're expecting a war agent thought. How do you know who I am?
I can't recall another game where characters repeatedly noticed my clothes, die by my hand after siding with them, or being introduced to Nolan North like this.
Did you know at 400 miles an hour, soccer balls can decapitate people?
However, the game's other psychopath, the aforementioned 80s obsessed Konstantin Brejko, is the sole reason this game has been completely scrubbed from digital stores since 2019, due to his Boss Music pick of Autographs Turn Up the Radio. While Alpha-Protocol was Obsidian's first original IP, due to exigent circumstances, they don't own the IP.
I remember having a conversation with him on Альфа-протокол, like, you know, at some point that music license is going to expire, and that's a problem. And that 5-minute conversation, though, is all you're willing to devote to it. Because you just don't have time. There's so many other things that you're trying to focus on, finish, and that's what happens. And this is what happened with Альфа-протокол.
What cost Obsidian the opportunity to realize a sequel now cost their first game the opportunity to be officially bought. Abandoned next to the 27,000 other games in the abandonware pile. Until today, because Alpha-Protocol, the worst game I enjoy, is available on GOG right now, with achievements, localization, compatibility, cloud saves, and DRM free, all the while retaining everything from the original game, including licensed music. Not that I can play it on YouTube, but that's a Google restriction. The game? It has none. I'm running it off a thumb drive right now, with its folder changed to the main character's password after modifying the game files to give me better gun accuracy than Church from Red vs. Blue.
Why is the crosshair so big?
But hold on a second. This doesn't answer the question of why. Why do all of this for this? I can personally attest that Alpha-Protocol is not the most attention-grabbing product ever released. So perhaps it was easy? Something that could be done in a couple weeks, after a couple calls.
I would say it took us roughly a year and a half.
Well, okay then.
I've seen it happen multiple times, that sometimes it took us 5 years, sometimes it took us 9 years, but eventually we got what we wanted for gamers.
For us, it always starts with which games we haven't brought back. And for me specifically, Alpha-Protocol has always been this important game because I played it. In essence, this is a pretty simple reason for the game to get delisted, right?
We believe that this is a huge loss for the gaming community, and so we wanted to do our best to actually bring it back.
I think before Gamescom 2022, this is where I reached out about potentially bringing back Alpha-Protocol.
Given that we did a very good job with releasing their previous titles, they were eager to work with us and release Alpha-Protocol as well.
Finally, we got very lucky when it comes to amount of work that we need to do from the legal perspective, to put it this way. It was pretty straightforward. It was mainly about having the conversation, using the right arguments to convince them to look into it.
Why not just release an identical build to what existed previously?
Well, the biggest concern would be if they will even work. Most likely not.
At a friend's house, a big fan of Alpha-Protocol, really liked it. And I jokingly said, hey, put on Alpha-Protocol, I'll do a live developer commentary. So he installs Alpha-Protocol and he boots it up and it immediately crashes. We went looking online, Reddit, hey, Alpha-Protocol, it boots up and crashes, from like 5 years ago. And there's no responses to this post. We're like, okay, fine, I guess we're not gonna do that.
Oftentimes we don't have a source code, and that is where our magicians step in, and this is where they do all of the work that we can then show off to the community. In this case, we are very lucky because we could actually work on the source files.
If you have the source code, you basically, practically speaking, can do everything with the game. You have access to all of the information, you have access to the engine.
Achievements, we actually took some of the code from the Xbox version and then implemented it to our Galaxy SDK.
Was cutting content from the game ever a consideration?
I'd say we always take it as a last resort, because we need to have it complete, we need to have the best version possible, and stay true to what it was.
I'm working here at CD Projekt. One of the things that over the years that I've tried to get people to do is go back and play Альфа-протокол. And nobody had ever played Альфа-протокол, and nobody was able to buy Альфа-протокол. And even if they were able to get their hands on Альфа-протокол, it probably wouldn't run. I'm really glad that GOG is bringing it back. I'm really excited about it, actually.
Patrick Mills reached out to me and said, hey, we figured out how to get AP back online. Would you guys want to do some interviews for that? And we're like, what? Sure. I'm super excited for it. I think it's the greatest thing ever. I don't know how they did it, and I'm glad that it's going to be available again.
Альфа-протокол is precisely the type of game this industry is made to forget. It was lambasted by critics at release. It didn't sell. None of its most notable mechanics were replicated. No memes instilled it into pop culture. No spiritual successor renewed interest. No big media personality drew eyeballs to it. And the very people who funded it decided it wasn't in their benefit 4 years ago to preserve it. By all measures, Альфа-протокол had done nothing to deserve acknowledgement, let alone be listed for ownership. Except one: be played. By people that loved it, by people that hated it, or speaking from personal experience, a little bit of both. Whatever this game meant to publishers or the public, it means enough for creators to keep mentioning it, for players to keep analyzing it, and despite the immense effort required, for the people at GOG to make it last forever. There's just one problem. I couldn't shake a sense of doubt upon hearing GOG's mission statement. And just last month, I was reminded why. Spec Ops being pulled from all digital storefronts isn't GOG's fault. In fact, it's an almost exact repeat of Альфа-протокол. The game has licensed songs whose expiration dates were approaching, and while no official reason has been given, it can be assumed the game's publisher determined it wasn't beneficial to preserve their game. But it is an example of how stacked the deck is against anybody like GOG. Remember, 18 months is how long it took when they were lucky on the legal side. For the almost automated procedure of allowing one license to expire for one game, it takes years of emails, calls, coding, updating, and marketing to give that one game a chance to be made public again. Something that, due to a lack of source code, legal documentation, or just answering the phone, can become impossible to anyone operating within the law. And with the amount of video games being pulled, outright killed, this problem is far too big for one team to solve. It's a problem that transcends video games. It's in art, vehicles, software, agriculture, hospitals. The thing is, one team cannot guarantee me that Альфа-протокол will never be delisted again, because the world isn't made to allow that guarantee. Problems this big aren't on the shoulders of a company, but a system that is turning people against it. Last year's Game of the Year was DRM-free. Oscar-winning directors are advocating for physical media. Business owners are testifying in court on behalf of the right to repair. And even YouTube legends are building cases against multi-billion-dollar corporations for the right to play the games that you own forever, of which I plead anybody who can, starting April 2nd, to be a part of it. Narratives perpetuated by the system are being fought. From DRM to ownership, maintenance, and preservation, there's a slew of individuals, groups, communities, and companies fighting those narratives. And the reason I ultimately agreed to work for one of them here is that I believe these individuals, that their goal is to make games last forever. And one of the most convincing ways to show that you're serious about making games last forever is bringing back Альфа-протокол, because there is no industry reason to do it. And that's why it means so much that someone did. Ownership is complex. But I think the answer to this question is very simple. Who do you think should get to decide if you can own this game? A critic, a retailer, a publisher, or you?
I'm especially proud of the work that we did over the past couple years because we managed to convince a huge number of AA, AAA studios to get their games DRM-free on GOG. We are getting these titles day one more and more often.
This is not just for us 40-something-year-old dudes that used to play games back in the 90s. No. For example, Heroes of Might and Magic 3. The game that is primarily bought by people that are not even in the 20s yet. So there is, some games are really timeless.
Justin Britch, who's our current development director, said, I want to start a team that does nothing but maintains our back catalog so that people that want to have access to that can have access to that.
Why would you target those communities that maybe are not like super mainstream? I mean, that's why this company was funded, right? If not us, then whom exactly, right?
And a lot of those games that I played back in the day, the first XCOM, Syndicate, I think you guys published Syndicate Wars, I believe. Some of the games that I thought were lost to the mist of time. Because I started up at Pizza Games making boot discs for DOS, that kind of stuff was incredibly difficult to even play games back in the day.
Probably an impossible task to preserve every game. There's so many released. Like you look at the Steam listings every day and there's fucking 100 games coming out, right? And are you going to be able to preserve all of those? Probably not. But we as a culture need to take this more seriously.
I joined the tech team like half a year ago, so most of the heavy lifting was done by my colleague. A reverse engineer that wants to remain in shadows and just makes me do this stuff in his stead.
For us, it's a mission, and we just keep preaching, and hopefully next time we have an interview, I'm gonna be able to tell you, listen, all of the A-listers, they're working with GOG.